Well, Don had such white hair that Mike was, the sun was. But as he said, at least he has hair.
Yeah.
Some people mentioned.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Okay, we'll start the formal part of the process. Welcome to the first Kite Symposium here in Burlington at the Discovery Landing. I want to first of all thank the City of Burlington, Carla Marshall, Pamela Belgrade, and of course Peter Finn for their great help in making the facilities available to us today. So thank you for that. Today we're going to cover three basic areas. First, we call him Dr. Bob White is going to talk about Alexander Graham Bell's work with tetrahedral kites, and then Meg Albers is going to share with us a variety of insights she has the work she's been doing with kites around North America and the world, and then Dr. Thomas Shankin is also going to talk about his work with the 17th century kites as well, 18th century kites, sorry. As well as lead us through a workshop of making an authentic replica of an 18th century kite that he is kindly going to donate to the Kite Museum to be on display. So we'll start first with Dr. Bob White, who is from Port Colborne, Ontario. And Bob is a dedicated amateur kite historian who's been actively researching and writing about kite pioneers and their famous kites for the past 25 years. Bob was trained in historical methodology at Wilfrid Laurier University in Ontario. His writing has appeared in journals and on internet sites around the world, as well as his own. So welcome, Bob White.
Sir, I think you might have my notes too. Yes, you do. Thank you. First of all, I want to thank George for actually coordinating this event. I think it's a pretty unique start to something that hasn't happened here in Eastern North America, and I really appreciate that. It's quite an opportunity to collaborate with in person with two people that I collaborate with over the internet, Tom Shankin and Meg Albers. And it's really nice to know there's this great interest in history. There's a lot of people in this room who are great kiters, who have a deep knowledge of kites and probably can catch me up on a few of my details today. Okay, what I've embarked upon, and I started maybe 5 years ago, was looking at the work of Alexander Graham Bell as a kite pioneer. And one might think, well, that's really been well done and well treated, and it has in a general way. It hasn't been focused on the way a kiter would look at it. Everybody knows about his huge ring kites. They know about his big cygnet kites that lifted people. But you don't just go out and build a kite that's the size of the cygnet, some 1,600 cells in size, and has to be towed on a boat. You just don't do that. You have to get to that as an end product. And how did that start? And what got him going? And what were the steps, minutely, as kiters would like to know, that he took from one point to another till he finally got to that particular place in time? And why was he pursuing kites as a lifting mechanism when all around him people were pursuing gliders? And there are answers to all of that hidden not only in his work, but in the newspaper accounts of the day, and even in his own journals. And I just want to take you through a bit of that for a moment. First of all, there's actually a myriad of resources available on him. And one would think that makes the job really, really easy. But it doesn't. The family papers contain some handwritten notes that he didn't post anywhere else. There was general correspondence to people like Samuel Pierpont Langley, and his points made there aren't written anywhere else. The Bien-Bray Recorder, volumes 1, 2, and 3, carry a lot of information about his work when he was at Bien-Bray in Cape Breton. And the newsletter of the Aerial Experiment Association, his lab notes, his home notes. He even had some stuff in his articles and speech files when he went out to speak about kites. And believe it or not, there are papers on his work with the deaf in which he alludes to kites when he was working with Helen Keller, because he brought her to BN in Quebec, Nova Scotia, and had her fly kites. So the true story from a kiter's perspective is buried in all of these details. And it's not details that a normal historian would pursue. Those papers are located all over. They're found in Washington. They're found in Cape Breton at 2 sources at the museum and Cape Breton University. They're in Hammondsport, New York, not that far from here, at the Glenn Curtis Museum, the ones at least pertaining to the Aerial Experiment Association. They're in Washington again at the National Geographic Society. And the Bell family members still have some in their possession in their homes, their summer homes in Quebec, sitting on the shelves in winter buildings that are closed up with no heat. And these are the original papers. Undocumented, different, and trying to get at those is really a challenge and very, very interesting. There are some clues in there about kites. And there are also scattered papers and photographs that have fallen into the hands of others, sometimes legally, sometimes perhaps even illegally, and are being sold today. So there's a lot out there on Bell that, if properly pieced together, will give us a different view of how he started on kites and how he pursued this. Journals and magazines, I'm not going to read through them all. Newspapers, all have of the era, all have accounts. And there's a lot of good authoritative books that deal with aspects of kites, but not the total story on those kites. Okay, let's move on then, just to show you some of the stuff you have to wade your way through. This is from the Curtis Museum, a bound set of volumes on the Aerial Experiments Association. Every single set of notes. My good friend Ted Shaw and I spent some time in those archives in the summer of 1908, or 2008, and we got to look at the inside of these documents. Drawings, photographs, just an amazing collection of stuff that you can't find anywhere else. To show you how tricky it is, you'd think maybe all of the things are in his published works, but Mabel Bell actually kept a journal. And in her journal, she sometimes refers from her perspective to his kite work. Very interesting insights that aren't found anywhere else. Here's one example. When she was traveling from Cape Breton to Boston, late December of 1905, she was on a train, and just a few days prior, there had been a huge lift on the kite field of the Frost King kite lifting Neil McDermott, one of Bell's assistants. And Mabel describes the whole event very differently than Bell, who wrote about it in a clinical fashion. Mabel describes how worried Alec was, how much she feared for the safety of this guy who was being lifted, and she even takes some time to diagram what it looked like from her perspective. She was that awed with both the power and the danger of kites. So in all of this stuff, I'm just trying to give you a historian's overview. This is what you have to dig through to get to the true story, point by point, step by step, date by date, of Alec's kites. Newspaper accounts give you a particular view of the time, sometimes well managed by Bell himself because he released the press releases. And there are even artifacts out there from the original Bell era, and they're scattered all over. This particular tetrahedral kite is in the National Museum of Science and Technology in Ottawa. And when I was doing research on Marconi, I stumbled across this because they thought it might be interesting when I was looking at Marconi's kites to say, hey, we've got a Bell kite here. And this one had been passed on by his daughter to someone in Ottawa and eventually found its way into the National Museum. It hasn't been restored. If you ever wondered what the original red silk looked like, there it is. And that's the one with the small spruce frames. Those are the small cells. And it's pretty tattered, but it can be restored because the frame is intact. And that was one of their goals to do sometime when they got the money in 2010. I haven't followed up to see if that's been done yet. Bell himself drew all kinds of pictures, and they give us lots of interpretation, but often they leave you open to as many questions as there are answers. Okay, let's just talk about how he got into kites. In 1875, and we all know about his work with the telephone. We're not going through his life here, but there's some things you need to know about how long he was interested in kites. In 1875, when he was working on the development of the telephone, he was working in a 5th-story garret above some shops and apartments with Thomas Watson. And the work was pretty intense, sometimes pretty frustrating. And they one day decided they were going to go for a walk, a change of scenery, and they went to nearby Swampscott. I don't know if I'm saying that right for you Massachusetts folks that are here today, but it's a beach town north of Boston. And they just decided to go for a walk to clear their head. And they came across a dead seagull. This is not the same seagull. And Bell stopped, and this is what Watson wrote. Watson recalled that Bell spread it out on the sand, measured its wings, estimated its weight, admired its lines and muscle mechanism, and became so absorbed in its examination that he didn't seem to notice that the specimen had been dead for some time, and I had to move downwind. At this point, after doing all of this and making notes, Alec noted to Watson, someone would soon be building a flying machine that would carry people. That was in 1875, long before he even started. He hadn't even finished his work on the telephone. So Watson was always amazed by his speculation and ideas, and he said, Bell's head seems to be a teeming beehive, out of which he would often let loose one of his favorite bees for my inspection. A dozen young and energetic workmen would have been needed to mechanize all of his buzzing ideas, and many good ones were probably lost over the years. Now, Bell's first career was a teacher of language, elocution to be precise, and he worked a lot with the deaf. Indeed, he said that that was his greatest work, and if he could be remembered for one thing, it was to be remembered as a teacher of the deaf. Not the telephone, not the invention of the iron lung, not the photophone, not fiber optics, which carried light and sound, not even his work with the airplane or the hydrodrome. He wanted to be remembered as a teacher of the deaf. And it was this teaching of the deaf that was very fortuitous for him, because it led a gentleman from Boston to bring his daughter to Bell to be taught how to speak and continue her work after she had become deaf. And that was Mabel Hubbard. And Gardner Green Hubbard was the prominent Boston lawyer who sought out Bell. And he started teaching Mabel at the age of 15, just as a student. And he became very fond of her. There was several years age difference. And that was really probably one of the best things that had ever happened to Bell. Not only did he find his soulmate, but in the father-in-law, inadvertently, he had found a man with great connections. And Gardner Green Hubbard went on to help him with his patent, to fight the many lawsuits that came after his patent on the telephone, and also became a good supporter of him, introducing him into Washington, D.C.'s social structure, which became a very big part of Bell's scientific work later. Well, in June of 1879, he married Mabel Hubbard, and Alec now had both a lifelong companion and a muse. Mabel actually kept him focused for much of his work because he was manically jumping from idea to idea all of the time, and she needed to keep him on focus. So on a trip to Newfoundland with Mabel and her dad and mom, they stopped in at a tiny little town of Bedeque on their way to Sydney, Nova Scotia, where Mr. Hubbard had investments in coal mines. They were so enchanted by Bedeque that they decided they'd like to live there, and they began to gather land on the point known today as Banbrea. And they gathered that land, and that became a refuge for them as they moved forward, a place where they would spend 7 months or more every year in splendid isolation, if you will, from the demands of his life in Washington. And they built this huge home with many outbuildings, and I know a number of you in this room have been there more than once. and even had the opportunity to fly kites on the hallowed kite grounds. But it was here that so much happened with his work on aviation and kites. It's important to point out that Bell's work with the telephone made him one of the most famous people of the era. And he was constantly pursued for attention, and he found this retreat to Bedeck, Nova Scotia to be very, very good for his soul, good for his thinking. It's hard to know if Bell was a scientist or an inventor. Most people put him down as a scientific inventor, because what happened a lot of the time was he did some trial and error things that weren't pure science to make sure things worked. But in any way, he was very, very much revered in his day, and he used to bring men of science to visit him here at the Andrea. And in 1897, his father-in-law died, and thrust him into the role of president of the fledgling National Geographic Society. And that got him really into the Washington circle of scientific people. A year later, in 1898, he was installed as a regent in the Smithsonian Institution. And that was very important as well, because he got in touch with a gentleman by the name of Samuel Pierpont Langley, an astronomer and mathematician who founded the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory. Now, Langley was experimenting with flight in 1887, and this really intrigued Bell. They had many long conversations. Bell invited him to the Andrea to have spend a summer, and they were there for 2 weeks exchanging ideas about flight. And then he really decided to focus in on the challenge and the problem of flight. This was something, though, that wasn't only being explored by Langley, it was being explored all around the world. And I want to show you some of the things that were going on prior to Bell getting involved with flight. I'm going to go quickly over this, but it raises questions to somebody who's a historian as to why did he continue to work on kites when others were seemingly going beyond this. Here's some names we're going to pursue for a second. Sir George Cayley, way back in 1804, 70 years, 80 years before Bell became interested in flight, had sketched out a glider that is today considered to be a sketch, and made models of gliders that's today considered to be the premier first flying machine with the principles of wings, control, and so on. It was only a model, but it was the beginnings of what led to flight. And this was widely known. Cayley wrote, and Bell, being a man of science and invention, subscribed to all the journals of the time, even corresponded with some people, not with Cayley because he was long dead, but he certainly knew about his work. A fellow by the name of Alphonse Pinot, in 1871, had actually invented a rubber-powered airplane. 1871. This is a long time before the Wright brothers. And there's the actual sketch of Pinot's flying device called the planophore. Now, it makes you wonder generally with aviation, with sketches like this, which we know today in retrospection, look a lot like an airplane. Why did it take so long to get to powered flight? Well, Pinot actually marketed this as a toy. It flew beautifully, and he was quite successful with that move to America to try to make his fortune, and found that the sales didn't go quite as well. He also invented an early helicopter that you spin in your hands. And look at his 1876 drawing of his Aero Pinot 2. It has landing gear, puts the pilot in the middle, has a rudder on the tail for control. Why did it take so long for people to get to powered flight when people with this kind of inventive mind were pointing the way? These things Bell knew about, and yet later he would still hang on to kites. Another one was Otto Lilienthal, German gliding expert. You can see the big bird-like wings that inspired his gliders. And then Octave Chanute, even closer to Bell's time, who pioneered hang gliding with a double wing glider, very much like the Wright brothers and the AEA airplanes. off the sand dunes just north of Chicago. All of this was going on, all of this was recorded, all of this was shared among the people who were interested in flight. It was in newspapers. So there was a lot of information, and yet Bell clung to the idea that the kite could be the solution for powered flight. He was also very much influenced by Langley. Langley built model aerodromes, and there you see one that was powered off a houseboat in the Potomac. And Langley admired Bell so much, respected him, he asked him to come along with his camera, and Bell would row out with a rowboat into the Potomac River, and he would watch and photograph these events of these models flying. And again, this is before he really got going on kites, and he could see the winged future different from a kite. He saw it firsthand, and yet he chose to go with kites. Really interesting. Langley had several models, some of them very large, flew them off houseboats in the Potomac, and Bell invested $5,000 of his own personal dollars in helping Langley to build what was going to be a powered full-scale model. Alas, that didn't work very well. We'll come back to that for a moment. With the excitement around Langley's models, Bell got really interested in flight. And he started exploring, first of all, with helicopters. And how many of us have seen those little things you can still buy today for kids, these little powered helicopters that you pull the string and they go up in the sky? Well, they were obviously first invented by Pinot, the Frenchman. But Alex began to work with this a great deal, and he actually began to build them and try to test what made them work. And his early thinking was perhaps a helicopter device might be the best way to lift a person. Mabel took the two girls, Elsie and Daisy, to Paris, and she decided she wanted to take them overseas sort of as a finishing project to get them ready for an entry into Washington society. And so he stayed back at Bien Gray, and he started to work on this device. Constantly wrote to her, daily letters, and this will show you how involved Mabel was in his work. He wrote, he wrote about an explanation for the whole device. Very technical, exactly what was happening with it, the weight, and the fact that he could get it over 250 feet in the air. Very detailed correspondence. I've only extracted a few points here. But my point in bringing this to you is to show you that Mabel knew what he was doing, Mabel encouraged him, and here's her response. I hope that you have this is from France, written back to him. She wrote, I hope that you have succeeded in definitely fixing the center of gravity in the arms, and in determining whether putting the center of gravity further out of the arms by means of weights, you do increase the velocity per second and thereby cause a greater lift. This is a person who understands what's going on scientifically. I do so want your name associated with successful experiments in flying machines. She was pushing him to a project. I wish I could be in two places at the same time with you at Bien Gray and here with the children in France. You have always been very good to me, my husband, and I love you. She constantly supported, she constantly challenged, and she constantly directed. Sometimes, if you read her correspondence, she was really wickedly good at chastising as anybody can be. Meanwhile, Langley was moving on with a manned aerodrome. He had got $50,000 of the United States Army's money to build this huge device, build it on top of a huge houseboat in the Potomac. And Bell was called back to witness the flight. It was powered, it was had a pilot in it, and on October 3rd, 1903 rather, it fell off and it was damaged. It was rebuilt, and then in the right-hand picture, on December 8th, it caught on the catapult, and there was failure with serious damage, and Manley almost drowned in the Potomac. and Bell was there. Those are Bell's photographs recording this. Now the newspapers attacked Langley just with a vengeance. Man will never fly. This is a waste of government money. Anyone who pursues this is a so-called scientist, and they were referring to Langley and Bell. It's crazy, and it's a waste of the taxpayers' money and time. December 17th, 9 days later in 1903, on the sands at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, just a few days later, the Wright brothers would actually fly. How different would it have been if Langley had flown first? Would Bell ever have gone on with his experiments? What would have happened to a whole body of work that he entertained? Very interesting how all these things occurred. Now in this, Bell was just stunned by the press and their attack on Langley. And this is a big factor in why he turned to kites. He looked back through all the literature, saw that Lilienthal had died in his glider. Chanute had been severely hurt. Others had died in France with their gliding experiments. Langley's man had almost drowned. Great humiliation. And so he came to this conclusion. The lack of stability had been a cause of accidents in the past, and that automatic stability was therefore of major importance, something he had to overcome. Again, it seemed to him that equilibrium in the air could most safely be studied by flying the machine first as a kite. And we're better to start with flying the machine as a kite than by exploring kites themselves. Even though people were right on the verge, even though the Wright brothers flew in 1903, he took a backward step because he was so concerned about the safety of pilots. And he figured by studying systematically, he could build a device that would be safer, have better lift, require less power. And that's the critical factor in him going back to kites. He fully appreciated that takeoff and landing maneuvers were fraught with danger, and so he sought a safe way to do that. And like Langley, Blériot, the Frenchman, and others, he thought that operating from the water, he would do this with his kites, lifting them off the water, would be the safest way of launching, because if somebody spilled into the drink, at least they had a chance of swimming to safety or being picked up rather than crashing hard into the ground. So he spent a lot of time on that. I'm not going to read you this one, but Mabel, corresponding with her youngest daughter, Daisy Fairchild, later in 1906, said she never saw anybody like Alec for his inventive genius and his ability to wander all over the place. He'd see something and take off in another direction. And she really had to focus him to keep him going. And she wanted him to succeed again like he had on the telephone. And she kept pointing him and encouraging him whenever he did work with flight and kites. And that was a big factor in him sticking at the kite issue. He went to the Hargrave box kite when he got really serious about kites in 1893. We all know as kiters what the Hargrave box is like. It's two rectangles separated by long spars, somewhat inherently unstable from side to side. And if you were to cross brace it so it's more stable, as people like Cody did, you now start adding weight to it and decreasing the lift. That led to some of the winged box kites like Silas Bonine's and of course Samuel Franklin Cody's. But this is where Bell started. The first actual kites he used were Hargrave's box kites. Not his own design. He borrowed someone else's design. And that wasn't unusual. Every step forward technologically, in every instance that you look back on in history, people borrowed ideas from one another. Later, he would move to the triangular celled kite in an effort to decrease some of the bad factors of stability. Although the Hargrave kite is quite stable, he found that a triangular celled kite would be more stable and give you great lift as well. And the ones he built are built on a pentahedron design. And if you look at this, there are three sides covered with cloth and two open ends, which makes it a sided triangle. This was a step to the tetrahedral. The tetrahedral is really a convex polyhedron. It's got 4 faces, each of which is an equilateral triangle. And when Bell actually gets to this point, this is what he settles on as his preferred cell for a kite. Light, sturdy, lots of lift, no inherent stability problems, and they could be stacked together to make mammoth structures without increasing the weight and decreasing the lift. But it was a 3-step process with a few other steps along the way that I'm going to show you in some of these historic photographs, because now we're getting into the real kite work. Let's go back for a moment. Started with the Hargrave box, which had been invented by Lawrence Hargrave in Australia. Then the triangular cells, which many people were experimenting with. And finally, his own unique take on it, the tetrahedral cell. If you compare Hargrave's work of 1893 with Bell's work of the early 1900s, on the left you'll see Hargrave's diagram of kites. On the right you see some of Bell's diagrams of kites. Heavily influenced by others. Not a lot original here. He borrowed, added to. And that's not bad science or bad invention, but it should be acknowledged that he stood on the steps or on the shoulders of other giants to take his steps forward. Now these kites on the left, you look at the big boxy ones at the bottom, the round tubular celled kites at the bottom of the Hargrave's diagram on the left, you'll see come up in actual photographs of Bell's kites later. Now my next task was to get as many actual photos as I could of Bell's kites. And I think I probably have in my possession both a hard copy and a digital copy of about 35 to 40% of the photos. I'm striving to get every single one that I can find so that I can put forward this definitive list and steps that he worked with. As far as I know, this was the 3rd Hargrave kite he worked with. There were at least 2 other simple ones before this from his writings, but I haven't got pictures of them yet. He started, as you can see, I hope you can see, stacking 2 Hargraves in front of each other and trying to figure out what he was going to do to get lift with extra cells. You can see the cross bracing, the X cross bracing, to keep them from twisting in the air. They came back to the same old problem. The more frame structure you add, the more weight you add, the more you decrease the lift. A mathematical equation he couldn't overcome. He even tried making them steerable by putting rudders on the back that would self-adjust so that the kite would be more stable in the wind. And then he started moving on to those pentrahedron type cellular kites, triangular celled kites with the open ends, in an effort to see if they would be more stable and provide them with more lift. Following that, there were variations of those kites. Longer, cross-braced, diagrams and notes, and this is where you see what a historian's got to do. You've got to go not only to the hard pictures, you've got to go inside the written data, find out what he said. And some of this, as Meg knows, who's looked at this stuff as well, some of it's handwritten and hasn't been transcribed. Other stuff has been typed by his secretaries. And there's just sometimes some very, very great inconsistencies from one report to another that you have to try and puzzle your way through and hope you connect the dots correctly. 12 triangular cells, another step. 2 triangular kites, one inside the other. And you remember now, he's trying for not increasing the frame weight, trying to increase the sail amount, get greater lift so eventually he can lift a person. So he's trying everything he can think of to get lift maximized and weight minimized and yet still have strong, rigid framing structures. He went on to some others. Remember the Hargrave's drawings from way back, the big circular kites with a radial arm in between them. Well, Bell was copying these. Some of them are huge. Looking at the fact that those are the average sized men, look at the size of that kite. Another example, two of the wheels at the back, one at the front. I mean, those are huge kites. And there are instances where it would break half-inch new manila or hemp ropes. First time they've been used. There was so much pull from some of these kites. And there's one very bad photo. Bell was, remember, he did his own photography or had his own staff. And he would have struggled, they would have struggled with the same issue we do at one of our kite festivals of shooting up, oh, there's a lovely kite, I want to take a picture of it, and all of a sudden you look at it, even though it's digital, you say, too much light, exposure's wrong. Well, this was in the days of film, but that's one of the very few pictures of that kite in flight. And as much as you fool with it digitally, you start ruining its historical aspect if you make it a better picture. There's the cells, huge, huge structures. And then he went back to the triangular shaped kites again. And this, remember, is before we get to the tetrahedral cell. That's a very famous picture. I think we've all seen that one in a number of books. And he was actively involved on the kite field. And any of you who've flown on that kite field know that it wasn't mown, it was really an agricultural field, and the grass is often up, so people wear leg breeches to make it easy for him to get around, not be bit by those horrible little flies that can be there if you're back in the summertime. And there's one of the rare pictures of that kite in flight. And just like all of us, when you build a great kite, some days it comes down and goes into pieces. And there was failure as well as success. Then he started stacking them on long frames. I mean, there's more technical descriptions for this, but I'm trying to cover a lot of ground here, just give you the flavor for his steps. And he made them bigger and made more cells in the kite house and in the laboratory, 2 buildings on the grounds. He had a whole cottage industry of people making these. The women sewed the sails, some of the men in his employ made the frames. And eventually he got to these large structures. Remember, his goal was to lift a person and eventually have the kite propelled by a motor. You can see how huge these kites are. I'm going to back up for a moment, and you can see, notice the triangular bracing there on the frame. That bracing, when you look at it, is actually pyramidic in style, and it's one more piece than a tetrahedral has. But it was part of his learning, again, about applying geometric structure and to getting to the ultimate kite shape, which was the lightest and strongest. And there it is in flight, being lifted. And there is supposedly a picture of it up some considerable distance that I'm trying to get from the Grosvenor collection at the National Geographic Society. There, this one looking more like an airplane might. He worked at the model size as well as at the full size. And you see him hands-on with this. His notes after. This is where you learn about the kite structure when you read the notes in conjunction with the photos. And then there were some trips of whimsy. Places he went that you kind of wonder why he went there, but it's a magnificent kite. How's that for a framing task as a kite builder? Then you cover it with all those tetrahedral cells, or those open triangular cells, and you get a kite that size. And so far, by the way, I haven't been able to find any of that kind in flight. Again, I told in the Grosvenor collection at National Geographic Society, there are some that are unpublished. It's tough to get some of these things. This is again on the way to the tetrahedral kite. This one looks a little bit space age, almost like a stealth fighter, separated by triangular frames. Different ideas for wing structure. And we told you that there was tremendous pull generated by these larger kites. And And that's what we've all wished we would have had on the kite field a few times when the winds came up. We had to winch something in. He had his own winch system built right into the kite field. There's the tetrahedral, the first pictures of it. He knew he was onto something. He even put a big backdrop up so that the photography would show up best. I'm striving to get larger photographs of this from the two collections that I know they're in. And there they are in a 16 cell configuration, which is very common in the bottom picture. And you can see 16 cell groupings could be combined. Each one not adding much weight, each one adding more lift exponentially. One of his first diagrams heading off to patent on this item. And one of his faithful staff employees there showing a beautiful 16 cell tetrahedral kite. And I'm just going to walk over here and show Don Tufts for a moment, but you can imagine 4 of these together would give you the 16 cell configuration flying into the wind. Tremendous light, lift, very, very light. He made kites in several sizes, as you'll see in a moment. This was fairly close, a little larger than the size he used for some of his work, especially at the model stage. There were some larger than these that were made out of aluminum tubes and connectors. So he was using all kinds of material for strength and for lightness. Actively involved all in his kite flying. There he is pulling in a big one. 16 large cells. More and more configurations, joining 16 cell groupings. And the beauty of this is they can all be flattened down if you need to carry them somewhere. Although we all know in reality, from our own tetrahedral kites that we built, that looks better than it actually is when you go to reassemble them on the kite field. Some were that large, built of cells that large, of aluminum tubes. So far, that's the only picture I can get of the cell that size. I don't have any pictures yet of kites built of that, but I understand there was a 16 cell from his writing that there was 116 cells in size built of that size. And I don't have the exact dimensions. This is another thing I'm trying to track down for kiters, are these kind of details that would appeal to kiters. He started then, once he got these configurations larger and larger, remember going back to that idea of putting them on the water so that if they could lift a person, he would have that safety cushion of the kite coming down slowly, not plunging like a glider would do, and also the being able to lift off and land on the water. He built pontoons using the tetrahedral framing structure and covered them with both oilcloth and Japanese waterproof paper. Tom and I have been struggling over exactly what kind of paper that would be. It appears as though he learned about that on a world tour that he was on about the telephone when he and his family visited Japan. There's a lot to be ferreted out, dug out, and put down into the record yet on these issues. There's a famous picture of him in the kite house as they're puzzling over some aspect of a tetrahedral kite. Great photo. And the strength of the tetrahedral frame. Very light, very strong. Look at it, it's holding up 4 people. For those of you who got really interested in the AEA's airplanes, the Junebug and the famous Silver Dart, the fellow standing on the left in this picture is Baldwin, Casey Baldwin, who became one of the members of the Aerial Experiments Association. Neil McDermott is the guy with the cap. He's the one who was lifted by the Frost King, the first person to be lifted by one of Bell's kites. This is an interesting thing. In 1901, he needed to assemble these large kites on the kite field. And so he designed the world's first space frame. You see these now as backdrops for outdoor concerts and so on. He designed this frame which could be left on the field and wouldn't have to be taken in the winter, or wouldn't have to be taken in at the end of the day. And you see at the bottom of the photo what appears to be something white. That's a rolled up tarpaulin that was just pulled up over this space frame. It would be a windbreak, and then they could assemble these huge kites because all the cells had to be carried out at the kite house and assembled on the field. And so that's something that I just stumbled on. And you know, how did he do all this stuff? Well, there were techniques he had to develop. This is one of 3 kites that Bell made of tetrahedrals that he raised into the air by hitching them to a horse. And this was a great sensation. The Washington Post actually published a photograph that shows a horse galloping through the field with this kite flying in the air. This is a floating kite built of tetrahedral cells, 3 floats built of the same type of material. And then again, they got so big they had to be put onto small barges. This one actually was on its own floats. This is the Mabel 2. He named all of his big kites. There was, incidentally, the white wing, the white kite, the red kite. And isn't that, goes back to the AEA when it was the red wing and the white wing was the first 2 planes. But 2 of his largest kites, the first one was the red kite, the second the white kite, were parallel to his AEA work later. And there is a dramatic photo taken from the back of a steamer on Bedek-Spredor Lake as the Mabel 2 is rising out of the air, or rising into the air out of the water. And that photo is a rather dramatic photo of the liftoff point of the huge tetrahedral kite. There's another model. And then after they tested the models, they would go to the full-scale kites. Some of you have seen the small tetrahedral cells, the size of the smaller kite there. That's what they were mainly used for. The larger cells, not the very largest one I showed you, but larger cells were used for the big kites that actually lifted people, or tried to lift people. And sometimes it didn't work, just like we've had those experiences. This one looks like a Buck Rogers version of a kite. Here he was trying to get the airplane configuration, and you can see the wings. He's now moving kites into wing-like structures. This is 1907. There's one with an engine in place. The whole family around, by the way. They were very involved. There's Mabel right next to him. Always encouraging, always pushing, always focusing, trying to keep him on track with his work, which was getting great press all across the world. There's a model being towed out. Look at the structures he had built. It's estimated that he spent over $100,000 on kites and her money for the Aerial Experiment Association. Today, that's close to, I should actually do the money conversion, but it would be well into the millions of dollars, which was a good thing he had the wealth, and Mabel managed the money and doled it out to him for his experiments. And then we know that the work concluded with the Aerial Experiment Association, the large kite known as the Cygnet, and ultimately the most famous airplane of all that they produced at the end of their work, the Silver Dart, which flew on Bedek Bay on February 23rd, 1909, just 101 years ago. So that gives you an overview of where I'm at. I estimate it's going to take a couple more years to finish this. Have it written up, illustrated with the actual photographs, notations below the photographs that go with it. But I wanted to give you a point of where I'm at, what I'm dealing with, how exciting it is, how many challenges there are, and I hope that the story will be one that appeals to kiters. There's much of it out there written. I'm not breaking totally new ground, but I think the detail that I'm bringing and the continuity and the timeline will give some insights that kiters will find particularly appealing. So again, George, I thank you for this opportunity, and to all of you who've taken the time to come out. And if you've got a couple of questions, I'll answer those, or try to, and then we'll turn it over to the next person.
Just a couple things. I'd like you to either confirm or deny that I thought were true, but like I said, it's hard to know for sure. And I certainly could pull up my old article and look, but I was under the impression that Bell, if it not invented, probably not the right word, but advantage of, and I think it was called the Newman principle, that he started with the Hargrave box fight, which I have a picture of Bell and Hargrave
Yes.
together. He went to
Okay.
Australia and spent time.
I don't have that. That's wonderful.
Oh, yeah, okay.
You're my best friend, Dave.
Yeah, so Bell goes to Australia, visits with Hargrave, and starts making larger and larger box fights until he realizes that certainly isn't going to work. Making it bigger in and of itself is fraught with problems. So the Newman effect, if I remember it correctly, is just putting a bunch of smaller ones together, and he realized that that was the way to get bigger, not by taking a box and just supersizing it, but by taking, whether they're tetras or boxes and making that, is it?
That sounds
Yeah,
correct. I
that's-
heard it, there was this Professor Simon Newcomb.
Newcomb, yeah. Yeah,
He was
okay.
actually a Nova Scotian as well, very famous as a
And they
mathematician.
were talking one night, and Bell was
Yes.
telling them, I keep making them bigger for more lift, and that's when they worked together and realized that that's when he started with thousands of
Yes.
tetras, making it.
In fact, Newcomb, as a result of their discussions with Langley that summer and Bell, actually wrote a paper called The State of the Art of Flying, which was prior to one of the Wright brothers. And he's often cited as predicting that man would never fly. But if you read the article really closely, he says man will not fly until he overcomes this issue you're talking about, the issue of weight to lift.
Yes.
And it was reported in the newspapers at the time, because they didn't understand, we have the ability to look back, that Newcomb said man will never fly. And what he really said was man won't be able to fly until he overcomes the lift to weight ratio issue. And so you're right, that's where Bell then started stacking kites and looking for a lighter frame. You're correct.
Just a couple other, and the journal I read, this is just more of an interesting tidbit. Mabel's the one who said, because Bell, as a kite flyer, was complaining about the lack of wind during the summer, and how he was often frustrated by days of, the dog days of summer. And Mabel was the one who said, the horses, pull him behind the horse.
And
So
she-
Mabel invented traction kite. Well, no.
traction kite, or reverse traction kite.
Yes.
She actually paid a village harness maker to make a special harness for the horse
Mhm.
that was like a collar, but it had special hooks on it so that the kite could go onto the hooks. You're correct. Very good. You know your stuff. Okay, Pete?
Have you any idea how much time Mel dedicated to this? I mean,
Considerable, Pete.
this is after a lot of his prior invention.
Yes, it was.
I'm not saying this was a retirement project, but I mean, was this?
Well, yeah, he was too young to.
He was 29 when he invented the telephone.
Yes.
He was 29. To this day, it's the most profitable patent ever registered.
And because of his father-in-law, who helped form the Bell series of companies, he became very, very wealthy. He turned all his money, by the way, over to Mabel to manage. As a wedding gift, he gave her all his stock in the company, and she managed the money. But then he went through a whole series of projects. He studied the eugenics of sheep, the iron lung, the probe for President
X-ray.
Garfield, the X-ray, early
McKinley
X-ray.
was shot in Buffalo, and because of McKinley dying from the infection of trying to dig out the bullet,
body.
he invented the precursor to the X-ray machine.
That's right, which was a probe.
So this was at a time when he was working on other things as well? This was
Yes, but he gradually, I think because of the attention of the world on this concept of people wanting to fly, he became intrigued, certainly because of his close liaison with Langley and others. It was a problem that he could really sink his teeth into. He wanted to go a slightly different path. He was such a humanitarian. He was very concerned about deaths and injury.
That's why he stopped eugenics, because of what was going on in Germany. He was a big part of
Exactly. His
it.
eugenics with sheep was to get rid of.
Well, the more teats, the ones.
That's right.
He wanted to figure out why some had more teats than others.
And produce more effective sheep or better sheep. But the eugenics stuff that was starting to go on in Germany in the early 1900s led him away from that.
So, because it seems with the facilities that he had, with all the money he invested, it wasn't just something that he was going to walk away from and come back to.
Right. In fact, the laboratory that he built at Villa Maria was not originally for kites. It It was a laboratory for any experiments that he could get his head around. And then he converted it to a kite lab, and then eventually, that wasn't big enough, the laboratory. And so he built something called the Kite House. And then down by the lake, he built a special building for the huge kites so that they could be put on these barges or on the floats that were attached to them and towed out into the lake and lifted off the waters. So increasingly, he turned his attention to flight. And then when McCurdy came home in 1906 from the University of Toronto, brought with him Casey Baldwin, who had graduated as an engineer. Baldwin stayed on, and suddenly the kite work accelerated with Baldwin's youthful engineering. And then in 1907, McCurdy came home. Glenn Curtis's motor was brought up there. Selfridge was brought in from the United States Army, and they formed the Aerial Experiment Association, and then things really got rocking. But of course, they eventually, or very quickly, went to the wing structure, and the red wing, white wing, June bug, and silver dart.
Just a very quick question before, the second one I have was, why did they take them out on barges? What was the purpose?
Why did they take them out on barges? Because they had no wheel carriage, and if you know the hillside at Bray, there's no way you take them off on wheels. And these were so big, you had to get them in motion to get them to lift. So you had to have some forward motion to enhance the wind, which a motor would do for you eventually.
Yeah.
But by taking them out onto the lake, towing them behind the steamer, heading into the wind, you got additional wind velocity to raise the kite. So that's why that was done.
Yeah, just a couple of comments. The Ben Bria, when we were out there, was explained to us, Bell didn't like heat, the summer heat in Washington.
He hated it.
So he hated it. So that was one of the main reasons why he went to Ben Bria. Another invention he was working on was air conditioning.
Yes.
So because of the same thing with the heat.
And pump cool air up
with
electrical fan motors in the basement of the house to cool his sleeping quarters.
Yeah, but he also was, I think, working on mechanical air conditioning too, if I remember from the museum there.
Yep.
A couple of other comments. Why he's got so much documentation is because of his patent battles over the telephone. So he was very careful in documenting everything that he did, including all the photographs, because I don't know if he took the photographs himself, but he had a photographer with him, and many of the pictures are posed.
Yes,
And
well, you can see that in some of the kites holding.
And even the ones like with Mabel there, could be, because a lot of those were posed because they couldn't be moving with the cameras they had in those days. And that's the other reason why the tetrahedral was red, so that it would show up better, and the red silk would show up better in the sky in the photograph.
It showed up as dark because there was no color film at that time. And the other thing was the chief photographer was David McCurdy, Douglas McCurdy's father. And he kept a record. And interestingly enough, it was only 25 years ago that we found he had an album of some prints that aren't actually in the Bell collection. That's now been turned over to the museum in Quebec. So there's a lot of stuff, tons of stuff on this guy, which makes it very challenging to get it right. But there's still some missing pieces, and I'm just finding it fascinating. I thought when I first started on this, I was going to do this only for myself, just to get the story straight in my head. And now I can see that nailing down all of these details will be really interesting. So
the other thing too was I think Bell hung on to the tetrahedral longer. The young guys wanted to get to the wing, and he was the one that hung on to the tetrahedral longer.
He did.
He
He,
finally
in fact,
convinced them.
one of the commitments they had to make was that they would try to put a motor on the Signet and fly it. And if you'll note in the stories about final days of the ADA and the Silver Dart in Quebec, the Silver Dart's motor was actually mounted on the Signet and it trundled across the ice, but it didn't have enough power to lift it. And they did that on February 22nd. They remounted the motor on the morning of February 23rd in the Silver Dart, and the Silver Dart flew in Quebec, that same motor that had tried to lift the Signet Kite. So yeah, there's a lot. And to get it all in exact sequence and nail these things down and finding both a fascinating and tough historical challenge. At least it's testing my skills.
Just two quick
Yes.
points. I can remember that one of the letters, one of the greatest things, when I think it was 20 years ago, I first found in the Library of Congress all these handwritten journals. They had such beautiful handwriting that it's really easy to read. But I can remember one of the letters specifically, and it says, there was a postscript at the bottom, and it said, Mabel, my biggest fear is that I'll only be remembered for the telephone. Because he was already regretting it. And it was amazing how he had all these operators, and one of his inventions, Mabel probably can speak better to it, but he realized that one person could now do the work of like what 20 operators used to do, and he saw that his inventions were already putting people out of work, and then it disturbed him greatly.
It was a great humanitarian.
Oh, yeah, it was amazing. When the first article I wrote on him back when Roger Chuning was editor of Kite, we had quite the battle, because I started the article, or maybe the second or third line was to the effect that if Bell was alive today, they would call him attention deficit disorder and medicate him. And, you know, and what would we have lost if those, and Roger thought that I was going to offend and upset people. But because everything you said, you know, his father-in-law, everyone said he would flip from, you know, from one to the other, and he would go all over the place, and he couldn't stay concentrated. And I said how important it was to show that, you know, they're over-medicating. We're losing a lot of great inventions today because they're just medicating all these kids. But I won that battle. We kept the line in. And when I met his grandson, when we went up the first year, and I told him that story, he looked at his wife and he said, they have since found it running in the family.
I was just looking through my notes here, but Charlotte Gray, in her most recent book, which is excellent, we should get Reluctant Genius.
Okay.
She actually makes this observation that he had so many ideas and so much energy for ideas that